In a previous video called Bad is Stronger Than Good, we talked about some of the key ideas and research from evolutionary psychology. In this video, we'll go over some of the basic principles and underlying logic of this area of science. Charles Darwin is largely considered a pioneering theorist and researcher who coined many of the ideas about evolution that we still use today. Aside from just making observations about biological evolution, Darwin also wrote some ideas that we now call evolutionary psychology, including the idea that some of the stuff in our minds came about because it was adaptive. Some of the cognitive and emotional processes we have now may have been the result of natural or sexual selection. Evolution itself simply means change over time, driven by successful reproduction via natural selection. Some equate evolution with survival of the fittest, but survival is only important in as much as it contributes to successful reproduction, that is, producing offspring. Reproductive success, not survival success, is the engine of evolution by natural selection. Simply surviving and living a long time but not passing along genes to the next generation is not adaptive. You can survive to be 120 years, but if you fail to mate, you fail to reproduce and your genes die along with your body. Every living human today is an evolutionary success story. Each of us descended from a long and unbroken line of ancestors who triumphed over others in the currency of survival and reproductive competition. As their descendants, we inherited the adaptive mechanisms for a mind designed for success. At the broadest level, we can think of organisms, including humans, as having two types of adaptations. One is survival adaptations, that is, whatever helps us to handle the hostile forces of nature, such as food shortages, extreme temperature, dangerous predators, and parasites. That is, humans have evolved specialized food preferences for fat and sugar, sweat glands, shivering mechanisms, fears of snakes, spiders, darkness, heights, and strangers. These helped our ancestors to avoid hostile forces of nature. The other type of adaptation is composed of those that aided our ancestors in mate competition, which brings us to a second evolutionary theory proposed by Darwin, sexual selection theory. Darwin noticed many things that could not be explained by survival adaptations. This included the bright plumage of peacocks, the large antlers of male stags, the wattles of roosters, and other structures that seemed detrimental to survival. The peacock's plumage, for example, is like a neon sign to predators advertising fast food here. So how could it be the case that these traits persist across generations if they make it so difficult to survive? Darwin's answer was the theory of sexual selection, the evolution of characteristics not because of survival advantage, but rather because of mating advantage. In the case of peacocks, females of this species are so attracted to the male's bright plumage that this confers on him many opportunities for successful mating. Sexual selection is a mode of natural selection in which two processes happen at the same time. One is where members of one biological sex choose mates of the other sex to mate with. This is referred to as intersexual selection. The second is where individuals compete with members of the same biological sex for access to members of the opposite sex, and this is called intrasexual selection. Male stags, for example, battle with their antlers, and the winner, often stronger and more formidable, gains access to mating with a female. These two forms of selection mean that some individuals have better reproductive success than others within a population, either from being more attractive or preferring more attractive partners to produce offspring. Now, you might ask, okay, well, why on earth would female peacocks prefer males with such bright plumage, given that it makes no sense from a survival standpoint for a bird to be such a clear target for predators? Wouldn't it make more sense for females to be practical in their preferences and choose males that are plain looking, since they're less vulnerable to danger? There are several ways to tackle this. The first is to recognize that in evolutionary processes, as with most things, there are trade-offs. Perhaps the plumage makes a peacock more vulnerable to predators, but perhaps it also reveals good genes for physical health and fitness. In other words, in addition to the vulnerability, there's also strength in the sense that perhaps some physical appearance reveals resilience to disease or parasites, or maybe intelligence. So by that logic, it actually makes perfect sense for female peacocks to choose males with bright feathers. In humans as well, we can see clear preferences for long-term mates with qualities such as kindness, intelligence, and dependability, qualities that make them good partners and good parents. Indeed, there are some studies that show higher physical attractiveness ratings predict better physical health as measured by things like cardiovascular risk a decade later. Not all studies show a clear link between physical beauty and health outcomes, but some do. Then there's the idea of the costly signal. According to this idea, if the peacock has very bright plumage that makes it a target for danger, and it still manages to survive without getting hunted and eaten, it must have some good quality that allows for that survival, because bright plumage is a signal that's very difficult, if not impossible, to fake. A costly signal exists only to communicate one's value to other organisms in highly social species. And humans do this too. When human participants, particularly men, are instructed to imagine themselves in a mindset for romance and sex, their behavior changes to be flashier, riskier, and more creative. Humans don't have bright feathers like peacocks do, but we do have a lot of different things to behaviorally show off our qualities. In men especially, this includes things like conspicuous and ostentatious consumption, with things like flashy cars, or with physically risky behaviors that run a higher likelihood of injury, but show off coordination, dexterity, and strength. Some experiments show that people get more creative when they're asked to tell a story while they're in a mating mindset. There are many, many ways in which people can communicate their fitness to others that they may want to attract. Sometimes it involves intelligence, sometimes dancing, sometimes popularity, sometimes with contests of strength or stamina, like in organized sports. Only rarely does this behavior involve extreme violence, as we sometimes observe in other animals like stags or beetles. The evolutionary psychologist Doug Kenrick said this: "Rich men, even those with high testosterone levels, do not typically go around getting into fistfights. They can win more respect by making clever investments or perfecting their golf swings. Men respond to romantic motives by showing off, by spending money in conspicuous ways, by acting like heroes, by standing firm against group opinion in ways that could make them look good, and by strutting their artistic creativity. In theory, people select others to mate with because they have desirable qualities that would also make sense in terms of successful reproduction and partnership. But as we said before, there are trade-offs. The person who spends lots of money on sports cars might be superficial. The one who does risky skateboard tricks might seriously injure or even kill themselves. The excitement we feel for others in a romantic and sexual context does come with a trade-off. Evolutionary psychology also suggests that there will be mental states that carry some benefit because they help us to live and pass along our genes. This focuses primarily on psychological adaptations, mechanisms of the mind that evolved to solve specific problems of survival and reproduction. Most evolutionary psychologists conceptualize psychological adaptations as information processing devices. As we saw in a previous video, it's easier for young humans to learn a fear response toward animals that may be threatening, like spiders or snakes, compared to things that are usually harmless, like flowers. This shows a psychological adaptation. Our capacity to learn a fear response is different for different environmental stimuli, and this is likely due to evolutionary forces because over millions of years, our biological ancestors faced survival challenges from dangerous predators rather than nice-smelling plants. Some theorists believe that romantic jealousy is one type of psychological adaptation. That is, if you see your partner flirting with another person and feel jealous, this could serve to alert you to pay closer attention to what they're doing and look for cues of infidelity, or to invest in one's attractiveness to maintain the relationship. As a scientist, I have mixed feelings about this idea. On the one hand, jealousy is commonly experienced around the world, and we see some evidence for it in other species as well. So perhaps it did evolve. On the other hand, and this gets to a couple of key points we'll get into on the next slide, the specific information and behavioral responses related to jealousy are interconnected with social norms. In some cultures, friends and acquaintances may stand more physically close to each other and may do things like kiss each other on the face when greeting or saying goodbye, and this would not be considered scandalous. But in other cultures, affectionate touching is strictly reserved for people who are either romantic partners or immediate family members, and to do so with someone else would elicit jealousy. Evolutionary psychology is fundamentally an interactionist framework because it includes cultural input as central to the activation or suppression of psychological adaptations. For example, The United States is generally seen as having an individualistic culture, while Japan is more collectivistic. In each type of culture, having social status is important, but in individualistic cultures such as the United States, status is heavily determined by individual accomplishments, whereas in collectivistic cultures such as Japan, status is more heavily determined by contributions to the group and group success. One of the more controversial sets of ideas in evolutionary psychology is called sexual strategies theory. This suggests that humans have evolved an array of mating strategies, both short-term and long-term. Due to the interactionist framework, the strategies an individual uses depends heavily on culture, social context, parental influence, and personal mate value, that is, one's desirability on the mating market. Initially, sexual strategies theory focused on sex differences in human mate preferences and corresponding strategies of mate competition. It starts with sex differences in parental investments, the minimum investment needed to produce a child. For women, the investment is large, including internal fertilization and gestation and a 9-month pregnancy. For men, the minimum investment to produce the same child is considerably smaller, simply the act of sex. Here's a quote that illustrates the logic of this theory. From puberty through late adulthood, males produce approximately 500 million tiny sperm cells per day. Females, on the other hand, produce an average of 1 large egg per month from puberty until middle adulthood. For males, whose contribution to their progeny can be as little as a few cheap sperm, the most effective strategy for achieving reproductive success may be to take advantage of all opportunities for sex with fertile female partners. The female, for whom every sexual encounter is potentially quite costly, is predicted to be far choosier in accepting or encouraging copulations. Once her egg is fertilized, she has to forego other reproductive opportunities for a relatively long period of time. Thus, her most effective strategy is to limit her sexual encounters to males who possess and appear willing to share valuable resources with her and her offspring. So basically, according to this theory, women should be choosier or more discriminating than men. Men will on average be motivated to engage in more casual sex, and men will sometimes deceive women about their long-term commitment in order to have casual sex, and men will lower their mating standards in short-term mating more than women. And the reason for this is simply because women have large gametes and men have small gametes. Women get pregnant and men don't. In support of this theory, men express a desire for a large number of sexual partners than women. Men want sexual intercourse more frequently, they're more willing to have sex with strangers, and are less likely to want emotional involvement with a partner before having sex. They also have more frequent sexual fantasies and fantasize about a larger variety of sexual partners. They're also more likely to regret missed sexual opportunities. The theory also suggests that men and women differ in their preferences for a few key qualities in long-term mating. Women more strongly desire mates who possess resources and are willing to commit those resources to her in order to help raise offspring. Men, by contrast, are more interested in women who are fertile and could bear his offspring. Across the world, men more than women desire partners who are physically attractive and relatively younger. There is no society in which the opposite is true. That is, there is no culture in the world where women are more likely than men to prefer younger partners and for men to be more concerned with partners' commitment and resources. But that doesn't mean culture doesn't matter. Culture has given rise to inventions like birth control, which allow more sexual freedom in men and women. Cultural norms also make it more or less likely that promiscuity will be harshly judged by others. This is sometimes called the sexual double standard. You see, sexual strategies theory lays out a pretty coherent explanation for why individuals make choices about who they have sex with, but it doesn't explain why people in the community would care about individual sexual choices. If a specific man or woman makes a sexual choice that is not ideal for them, it really shouldn't be anybody else's business. In fact, it might actually be advantageous for you if someone else makes a bad sexual choice. The fact that individuals would be shunned by a community for having lots of sex doesn't really make sense, and that's why I think it's important to consider critiques of this theory based on what we know about social norms. In some studies, including studies that I've conducted myself, people judge women more harshly than men in terms of things like intelligence and mental health, even when they engage in the exact same behaviors. Sexual strategies theory doesn't do a good job of explaining this. Furthermore, some studies, again, including some that I've conducted myself, men and women don't seem to show gendered patterns of attraction to others in real-world settings. Putting aside hypothetical surveys, everyone is more attracted to beautiful people like celebrities. Men and women show this pattern equally. It's not something that sexual strategies theory is able to explain.